Yeah, welcome everybody to the Maritime Museum, to my talk. And we'll just get started here. The restrooms, as I was telling some people just a few minutes ago, are going to be located as you exit back out to the lobby area, and then there's a hallway if you go to your right, and then down that hallway you'll see the restrooms there if you need to use those at any point. And let me just give you a brief background of my involvement in this exhibit. I am the co-curator of the Other Voices of Freedom exhibit, which, if you haven't gotten the chance to see it, is right over there. So after our time here today, if you did want to take the chance to go see the exhibit, it's right over here. We have a 600 square foot gallery space that's dedicated to that exhibit, which is a permanent exhibit, that we curated in conjunction, or sort of with like guidance a bit from the Haverty Grace Colored School Museum and Tony Cohn of the Menard Foundation, who is he's based in Montgomery County, Maryland. He's an African American historian whose research on the Underground Railroad as it existed in Maryland has been pretty profound. So he was able to also help to guide us with that. And we started developing the exhibit late 2019, early 2020, and it made its official debut to the public early last year. So, out of respect for everyone's time, this talk will be approximately 45 minutes. It's always kind of difficult to tell how long sometimes, and I do have a tendency to ramble a bit, but I will try to keep this 45 minutes with about a 15-minute discussion period to follow, so that we can have some time, I don't know if you just had any questions or anybody had any comments afterwards, that we would have, around 10 to 15 minutes for that. So the gist of this talk today really is going to be about the legislation that had an impact on African Americans, both free and enslaved alike, before the Civil War, and the trafficking of people in the area, and just how the laws in this area did have an impact as to the Underground Railroad's activities, and then how also the bounty hunters and opportunists in this area profited from this whole situation. And we don't have any kids today, but still, it was, I can just say personally for myself, this was rather like depressing subject matter to have to research and to help put an exhibit together on. And if anybody does feel, I've tried to kind of avoid sensationalistic or using any sort of like being too graphic in terms of what I'm going to talk about, but it can be upsetting to some. And so yeah, if anybody did feel at any point upset, you can certainly take a break or step out of the room, and I understand completely. And I used primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, and just the research. And sources are going to be at the end, if you're interested in seeing just sort of what sources were drawn from. Anyway, let's just go first to the kidnapping of Margaret Morgan. So in 1837, there were 4 Harford County men by the name of Edward Prigg, Nathan Bemis, Jacob Forwood, and Stephen Lewis, who conspired to apprehend a woman named Margaret Morgan, at that time a resident of neighboring York County, Pennsylvania. To give a bit of a background, the slave population had decreased over the preceding decade by over 10% in Harford County, while the free black population actually jumped by 50%. So enslaved people in the northern counties of Maryland would then flee to and through Pennsylvania in large numbers during the 1830s and the 1840s. Many of them were fearful of being sold to the deep south, where both the legal and illegal slave market had been thriving due to, the act prohibiting importation of slaves that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1808. So there were like labor shortages because of this, because no new slaves were being brought into the country at this time. So that was something where people were, these slave traders were starting to become desperate. Margaret Morgan was technically born into slavery around 1800, but her parents actually lived on the property of a man named John Ashmore, and they were allowed to live there. They were no longer really enslaved by John Ashmore, and I don't know if it's too early to go to this slide, but you can see this is a picture of what the property, well, I don't think it's exactly the property, but it's the general area in Dublin district of Harford County that his property was located at. So the Ashmore property, again in the Dublin district of Harford County, was where Margaret Morgan just grew up. There was no official manumission of the family, but they were probably informally freed from service prior to Margaret's birth and just continued to live there. And yeah, she very well may have been one of two females who had been recorded as slaves in Ashmore's household in the 1820 census, but we don't know that's the case. It is known that Ashmore did free at least 6 of his 10 slaves in the years immediately preceding his death. So again, we have to be careful with things that we don't know as fact. It could be verified as fact, but we don't know the names or who exactly, if Margaret Morgan was included in that. She did meet and marry a local free black man named Jerry Morgan. So Morgan is her married name. And so they remained in Dublin and raised a family in Dublin, Maryland. Neither she nor her parents were included in the 1824 inventory of John Ashmore's property. And in 1832, Margaret and Jerry decided to move their family to York County, Pennsylvania, where Jerry was actually originally from, the Airville, Pennsylvania area. So that, weakened any further claims that any of the Ashmore heirs had to either Margaret or her children. They moved without incident out of Harford County into Pennsylvania. No runaway ad was placed in the local papers at this time. It was just a totally normal thing for the family to move. And we know at least one more child was born after the move in the 1830s. Now, it wasn't until 1837 that Margaret Ashmore, who was either the widow or the daughter of John Ashmore, we're not completely certain. We think it was maybe John Ashmore's daughter, decided to actually pursue Margaret Morgan across state lines upon the death of John Ashmore. She hired her brother-in-law, Nathan Bemis, and fellow Dublin resident Edward Prigg to track down Margaret's whereabouts. There were 2 more local men, Jacob Forwood and Stephen Lewis, who joined them. And as was stipulated by state law, they were required to apply to any judge or justice of the peace or alderman, who would then issue a warrant for the person held to labor or servitude. And the men were indeed granted permission by a local justice of the peace, Thomas Henderson. So the band of men actually broke into the Morgan home and kidnapped the entire family just as they slept. This included Jerry, who, as we know, was born a free man, and at least one of the children who, the one child was actually born in the state of Pennsylvania. They were all loaded into an open wagon in a cold, rainy night that was described as very cold, rainy, and they scarcely had any of their ordinary clothes on. Were just basically rushed out in their pajamas. This was late March of 1837, and that must have just been terrifying. When the group of the men brought the Morgan family before Henderson, the justice of the peace, he actually refused to take further cognizance of the case. The official record is unclear about this turn of events and what compelled his change of heart. We don't know. Perhaps the presence of the children and her free husband caused Henderson to question the legality of the entire situation. Jerry Morgan was indeed released after it was verified that he was indeed a free man. He provided his papers. However, the rest of the family was just hauled back to Maryland after this. Okay. So, Jerry Morgan was deprived of the opportunity to plead his family's case, as Prigg and his accomplices actually took Margaret and the children back to Harford County before Judge Stevenson Archer, who sanctioned their sale at this time. Because there was, we'll even talk about it, or a little bit later on, Baltimore was a major slave market at this time. And what followed in the next number of months and years was a tense legal standoff between Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania governor, at this time Joseph Rittner, was alerted to the matter and wrote to the governor of Maryland at the time, Thomas Vesey, "I do not see how you can avoid complying without violating the Constitution, and yet your compliance with such a demand, that is, releasing Margaret Morgan and the children, would probably, nay, certainly produce great excitement and clamor." I think the man just had his hands tied in many ways, but you would just have to understand also that Maryland was a slaveholding state, and the mob violence towards anybody who helped in any way, like abolitionists who tried to help runaway slaves, or even people abducted like this who were wrongfully abducted. And it was kind of a tough situation, I suppose, for the man. Prigg and the others were indicted by a Pennsylvania grand jury for violating the state's 1826 personal liberty law. However, they weren't taken into custody for well over a year. And though they were indicted in 1837, Prigg was not apprehended until May the 23rd of 1839. Okay. Margaret had been held for a while in the Bel Air, Maryland jail cell. She was allowed to see the children, but they were just held in the jail cell like that, like common criminals. And Governor Vesey of Maryland submitted a special application to the Pennsylvania legislature to formally authorize the men's surrender. And the Harford County Sheriff had been ordered to assist your county officers with the arrests. He was absent when called for. So just a lot of people just not doing their jobs, and people who were not held accountable in this whole situation. And yet in York County, Prigg was found guilty of kidnapping by a judge in late 1839. According to Pennsylvania attorney Thomas Hambley, he had sold Margaret and the children to a southern slave trader, and unfortunately relevant records have unfortunately been lost in regards to where they ended up. there's no further evidence of their whereabouts after this time, as the petition for freedom had been denied in 1837 by the county court. Jerry Morgan was afraid to enter Maryland. Okay, that's not quite. Yeah. Her husband was afraid to enter back into Maryland, just due to obvious reasons. Instead, he went to Harrisburg to lobby the Pennsylvania governor for support, and then on his way back home, he was aboard a boat that was bound for Columbia, Pennsylvania. He tragically drowned. The situation surrounding that, it's a little bit murky as to what exactly happened, but a white man's jacket on board the boat was at some point lost, and the crew and the other passengers basically turned on Jerry, accused him of stealing this coat, this jacket, and, were pretty much, just attacking him, and he felt he had no choice but to jump overboard to escape them, and he was taken underneath the boat. I'm unsure, from the Maryland State Archives where I read this, I'm unsure if this means it was deliberate murder or if it was accidental, where he just couldn't come up for air, or if they were steering the boat to where he couldn't come up for, we don't know. I don't know, really. It's obviously extremely tragic that this guy lost his life over something so trivial. So after the 1839 conviction, Prigg and the other 3 men appealed all the way to the Supreme Court on the grounds that the Pennsylvania law was in conflict with the Constitution. And then this culminated in the court agreeing in an 1842 ruling where they voted 8-1 that Pennsylvania violated the Supremacy Clause, under which federal law supersedes and can render a state law to be unconstitutional, and the court disregarded Pennsylvania's 1826 personal liberty law due to what they decided was counter to the positive and unqualified recognition of the right of the owner of the slave. This was the Prigg versus Pennsylvania decision in a nutshell. So the court's decision essentially nullified local laws on the slave retrieval process and would make it even more difficult for free states to prevent similar actions by slaveholders and bounty hunters like this. Prigg, Bemis, Forwood, and Lewis did not face any additional consequences or criminal convictions for their actions. As slaveholders and slave catchers felt emboldened to pursue this increasingly profitable venture, divisions further deepened along regional lines, where you could see that this was contentious between Harford County and York County to the north, with just wildly opposing sentiments in regards to situations like this, where, one county felt that this is a free woman living her life, and, Harford County disagreed with that. So that's just the background as to how this Supreme Court decision came about. Now we're going to discuss the Fugitive Slave Act, which was just a few years later, after the Prigg case. And it was passed by Congress in 1850, and provided for the seizure and return of runaway slaves who escaped from one state into another or into a federal-controlled territory. And as you could probably imagine, the statute met with strong opposition in the non-slave-holding states, because it was pretty punitive. The fugitives could not testify on their own behalf in a court of law, were not permitted a jury trial. There were heavy penalties imposed upon federal marshals who refused to enforce the law or from whom a fugitive escaped. Penalties were also imposed on people who helped slaves to escape. Jail fines. Under this act, special commissioners were to have concurrent jurisdiction with the U.S. courts. U.S. courts in enforcing and upholding the law. So, it was pretty scary stuff at the time. And there was some backlash to it. For a number of years during the Civil War, the Fugitive Slave Act was considered to still hold in the case of black people that were fleeing from the border states. And it wasn't until June 28th of 1864 it was finally repealed. But yeah, for 14 years there, this was very much in effect. In response to this, number of abolitionists increased. The Underground Railroad had no choice but to become more efficient, more secretive, and new personal liberty laws were enacted in retaliation in many states like Pennsylvania, where they exercised their ability to then write their own laws in response to this. And these state laws were among the grievances officially referred to by South Carolina, who was first to secede from the Union in December 1860 as justification for its secession, which then, of course, this all has a snowball effect towards leading our nation into war, into civil war. So a lot of Southern politicians and some of these slaveholding states would often exaggerate the number of people escaping enslavement. They would blame the escapes on the northern abolitionists, who were said to be stirring up slaves and inciting slave riots, and interfering with these property rights in their states. And abolitionists, in response to that, called Fugitive Slave Act the Bloodhound Bill, just due to how they were being pursued, by people. What else can I say? It was extremely, like a free-for-all, basically. It was extremely frightening for a lot of black citizens, even in places like Pennsylvania, northern states that did not practice slavery in any way, shape, or form. They understood that they were still on thin ice, so to speak, or that they were at risk of being abducted because of just these laws that basically allowed them to be pursued with very little consequences. And they really had no guarantee of safety until the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, and really until the Civil War ended and it was abolished for good. They could be apprehended without due process or a proper warrant. So it was extremely scary at this time. Shifting gears a bit, we will then discuss actually the individuals who profited in the area from just the kidnapping and abduction of both slaves and free men alike, and just who they were and how they operated. First being a guy named Thomas McCreary, who Frederick Douglass denounced. This man is the notorious Elkton kidnapper. I think everyone knows who Frederick Douglass is. He passed through Haverty Grace actually on his way to freedom, which is an interesting tidbit that's explored here in the exhibit. So yeah, he was well known, this Thomas McCreary person. He was well known to, in the region, to a lot of like abolitionists and free men, and they were living in fear of this guy because he lived in Cecil County, Maryland, and so that's kind of near to being the midpoint between Philadelphia, which was at that time, a haven for escaping slaves, and then you've got the major slave market of Baltimore to the south, and Cecil County, and Elkton in particular, is kind of the midpoint, almost, approximately, between those two cities.
So yeah, the region was particularly volatile in the years leading up to the Civil War. McCreary himself was experiencing some financial setbacks. He was deeply in debt and declared insolvent by the county, Cecil County, in December of 1838. 2 months later, though, the governor appointed him to a state position in Elkton, indicating he had possibly found favor with the county's political bosses. So we do see him actually becoming more, currying favor with the political elite at this time. So these political relationships, we can probably draw the conclusion that they afforded him the support of his community in doing what he did. He was almost seen as like somewhat of a hero by pro-slavery advocates, and who applauded his actions, and some of the local papers even, praised him for how he was protecting property rights, so to speak, because at this point, as barbaric as it sounds, slaves were considered to be property, and his kidnapping, his forays into, as we will see, other states kidnapping people, this was almost celebrated. So we'll get into just a few of the people who, he actually kidnapped, and this includes minors, actually, teenagers and youth. He just would kidnap adults. He would kidnap people, under the age of 18. He just didn't care. So 12-year-old Elizabeth Parker was abducted in 1851 from the Oxford, Nottingham area in mid-December of 1851. And he sold her to a Baltimore slave dealer. Weeks later, he also took her older sister, Rachel. Men from Rachel's community and a Baltimore Quaker actually rescued Rachel from the slave pen that she was being held in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Grand jury in Chester County indicts McCreary in response to this. The Maryland authorities demanded proof of her identity and actually took Rachel into custody. Joseph Miller, who was Rachel's employer, claims that the girls were wrongfully kidnapped, and he actually went to go advocate for her. Elizabeth worked on the nearby Donnelly farm, while Rachel worked on Miller's farm. Okay, so Joseph Miller filed a lawsuit against McCreary and his accomplice, John Merritt, for kidnapping. At this hearing, McCreary claimed that the Parker sisters were actually another set of sisters, Henrietta and Eliza Crocus, and that they had actually escaped from an owner in Baltimore. So he wanted people to believe it was a case of mistaken identity, or like that he was unveiling that these sisters were actually this other set of sisters, and wanted people to believe that. A crowd followed Joseph Miller around town because, again, he went to go testify. He was actually the one who filed the lawsuit. They followed him around town, harassing him, threatening him. Joseph Miller disappeared later that evening, and the following morning, his body was found hanging from a tree, and an autopsy was performed, which revealed arsenic. Thomas McCreary actually tried to claim in court that Joseph Miller had actually died as a result of suicide. I think we can pretty much determine that that was a big lie, or we can pretty much figure out that that wasn't true, that he died by foul play. The Chester County residents were very much angered by Miller's murder and the continued confinement of Rachel Parker. They held a public meeting, and lawyers were appointed by the governor to represent her, while in Baltimore, officials continued to delay her plea for release and for a trial to be held. In January of 1853, after being in custody for a year, Rachel was allowed to present her plea, where over 60 white witnesses from Pennsylvania were present to support her and her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been detained for only 6 months, and then was luckily, she was allowed to go. This plea was successful, actually, so it has a happy ending. Both sisters, released, and this may have been kind of due to political maneuvering, because the two men that were appointed by the Pennsylvania governor to be the girls' attorneys were actually the Pennsylvania Attorney General and a retired justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So these were like heavyweights going down to represent her and get her freed. And in another incident, again of many people that McCreary abducted, a 17-year-old boy named Henry Lee Brown from the Downingtown, Pennsylvania area was actually lured to Philadelphia by McCreary on a fake job offer, and then he was just kidnapped. You can see Brown's former employer was contacted. For some reason, the slave dealer actually was persuaded, which is rare, to actually contact this man who employed Brown. The man traveled all the way down to Baltimore and confirmed that Brown had always been free and that he worked for him, was employed by him. So, yeah, it's good that these stories, I tried to find some stories that did have a happy ending to them, where people did actually band together and represent these people, these kids, these teenagers who were abducted and who just joined forces to, for justice for these kids. So, but unfortunately, the Maryland governor refused Pennsylvania's request for McCreary's extradition. He was just time and time again protected by the Maryland political elite. He was wildly unpopular in Pennsylvania, particularly again in Chester County and in Philadelphia, where he was committing these abductions. But everybody in Cecil County just loved him, and especially the political bosses in Cecil County just protected him and made sure he didn't have to stand trial. And yeah, he never had to serve any jail time for what he did. So, yeah, just in response to this this kind of conduct of people like McCreary, and there were a lot of behind the scenes sort of like people who wrote and advocated for stiffer penalties for people like him, and would warn their residents, again, in places like Chester County and Philadelphia, try to warn residents that these people were out and about and could possibly be, was a menace to them. So this is one of the abolitionist publications that I just found a snippet of, Blue Hen's Chicken. They did the reporting on these abductions and acted as watchdogs. People like the Quakers and other like abolitionist groups were often working tirelessly behind the scenes to try to identify and rescue people who had been abducted. They would often even have to go travel at risk of life and limb, because again, the mob violence, the people who, meant them harm, they would risk their own safety to then go down to Maryland to protest the arrests of people like the Parker sisters and Henry Brown. So yeah, really scary times. They were often just working against the efforts of both the bounty hunters as well as hostility that they receive from the judicial system in states like Maryland, and again, just how the public in general in Maryland, Harford County, and Cecil County was pro-slavery, and they stood to profit from these abductions of both escaping slaves, free men and women, and a lot of the reason why it was you would often see the white residents instead of black residents going down to help retrieve people who've been abducted was because, as we saw with the case of Jerry Morgan, it was even riskier for any black resident to go down to a state like Maryland, where because of laws like the Fugitive Slave Act, they could just get themselves kidnapped. That kidnapped was even best case scenario because they could even be killed. They could even be taken into custody, jailed, and it was like, just a terrible time in the country's history, where people like McCreary were able to basically stage these home invasions or actually lie and lure these people, like on promises of job offers to then be kidnapped. So, how are we doing on time, Crystal?
You're at 11:44.
11:44. Okay, we're gonna just wrap this up in the next probably 5 minutes. And we can, if some of you don't mind staying a little afternoon too, I just want to be respectful of everyone's time for the discussion period afterwards, or question and answers. So the last thing I'll touch on, and this is going down a little further down Maryland's Eastern Shore, is this gang led by a woman named Martha Patricia Cannon. She was born Martha Hanley, and usually went by her middle name Patricia, so Patty. And this woman was just a terrible person, headed a gang of kidnappers on the Delmarva Peninsula, where they kidnapped people, and she was allegedly born and raised in Canada, in Montreal, born to a well-off man originally from England named L.P. Hanley, and a former prostitute, where allegedly the family was involved in different illegal enterprises. They supposedly ran a brothel, and her father apparently worked as a gang leader, thief, smuggler, and was later convicted and hung for committing murder. So she did not come from like a nice family at all. Apparently she, his criminality was just, in her blood apparently. Patty was their youngest daughter, and at the age of 16, she met this wheelwright from Delaware named Jesse Cannon, who he had fallen ill while he was traveling in Canada, and sort of, I think with her mother's urging, she tried to kind of nurse him back to health and was kind of working her wiles on him. And once he recovered, he proposed marriage to her, and so that's where she moved with him down to Delaware, brought her back home to Delaware, and they began married life on the Nanticoke River near the town of Laurel, Delaware, and they were to have 2 children during their somewhat brief marriage, because after Jesse's mysterious, untimely death, people believed that she had actually killed him. Patty then moved after her husband's death to nearby Johnson's Crossroads, which is now Reliance, Delaware, where she ran a tavern that was strategically situated at the cross-section of 3 counties. It was Sussex County in Delaware, and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. So this was definitely a crossroads where she was located. So yeah, I lived right on the Maryland-Delaware border, and she would often be in trouble with the law. This was somebody who, the kidnapping was only one of the things that she did. Like, she was chronically in debt. I think that she was definitely, people in town tried to avoid her because she definitely had a temper and would fight with people. There were many other offenses that where law enforcement would try to issue a summons to appear in court or, assert a warrant, and her solution to this was that she would simply walk into another room in her house in order to be in the other state where the officers had no jurisdiction. And she joined forces with her son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer, and other local thugs to kidnap both free and slave people. Like, slave catching and trading, again, is a lucrative business at this time. And interestingly enough, Reliance, Delaware had more free blacks than anywhere else in the country. The group operated for about a decade in the 1820s and probably before that. So we don't know quite exactly when that they started their activities, but probably even before the 1820s. The gang included mostly white, but also a few members in the gang who were black, mixed race, and they were actually sent as decoys to Philadelphia to befriend free black people, youth, teenagers, who then got abducted. Just tricked them into thinking that they were going to possibly be employed. That was one of their tactics, is that they would actually promise them work as crew members on the boat, schooner that was owned by Johnson. And once aboard, they got tied up and taken down the Delaware River, down to the home. The gang would often supply slave traders who came from states farther south, like Alabama and Mississippi, that were experiencing labor shortages. The cash value of slaves shot upwards, creating a strong incentive for the kidnappers, because cotton was still king in the South. They still, were desperate for the slave labor. And nearby Philadelphia, actually, the reason they would often go to Philadelphia is because it had the largest population of free black Americans in the northern states at this time in our country. And yet Philadelphia lacked a unified police force. So also, we have to consider that the kidnapping of free black people left land and other property behind, which could then be looted, and the local white communities in at least Maryland generally didn't take action. However, in Philadelphia, they did take action. Philadelphia's mayor, Joseph Watson, who was a Quaker, actually made efforts to locate those trafficked residents who were abducted and sold, and offered rewards in the paper for their return. And in the abolitionist journal, The African Observer, that was published in Philadelphia in 1826, detailed accounts of the victims were published, and some of that is, obviously very, very, hard to read, but essentially captives attested that they were chained up in the basement, the attic, and other secret rooms, and hidden in the Cannon home. They were often put aboard a schooner, again, that was owned by Joseph Johnson, which traveled down the Nanticoke River to the bay, and then it was they were basically all shipped to Georgia and other slave markets further south, often never to be heard from again unless they managed to escape. The gang's activities spanned several years. They had a reputation for violence that made the local law enforcement officials hesitant to pursue them. And she held, oftentimes, she and her daughter were often just holding these meetings, escaping detection by the local authorities. And people were kept shackled up into the tavern without really anybody doing really anything to investigate, because they were pretty scared. The locals were pretty scared of the gang. And yeah, the conditions would have just been really, really unpleasant. The attic was poorly ventilated, didn't have windows, according to one person who managed to escape. It was sealed off. There was, chains. It would have just been terrible to have been there. And according to depositions from the former victims who regained their freedom and returned home to the north, Joseph Johnson kept them in leg irons and severely whipped those who insisted that they were actually free. There was a 25-year-old free black woman named Lydia Smith who testified she was kidnapped in 1825, kept in Cannon's home before being taken to the tavern. She was held there for 5 months, and then she was taken south. There was a man who was confined in the attic. He managed to escape by opening the trapdoor, and he still had his ball and chain attached to him, but he managed to escape. Yeah, she just, with impunity, she and the rest of the gang would abduct both the free men and the runaway slaves, and then just sell them to people to be sent further down south to more southern states. And the gang was initially indicted in May of 1822. Joe Johnson was sentenced to the pillory and to 39 lashes. Records show he did serve that sentence, but no one else in the gang was tried or sentenced during that time for quite some time. She herself was safe. However, the law eventually did catch up with her. The mayor of Philadelphia was on high alert. So a tenant farmer actually discovered the remains of 4 people on the property in 1829, which included 3 children, while he was plowing in the fields. And at that point, these discoveries were made on the farm property that Cannon owned in Delaware, and in April of 1829, she was indicted on 4 counts of murder for an infant female, a male child, an adult male, and another male child. And these were signed by the Attorney General of Delaware, James Rogers. Now, she had raised this boy named Cyrus James since the age of 7. And he was taken into custody and provided a witness statement. He was basically raised by Patty Cannon, and from the age of 7, and grown up in her home, and was groomed to join the gang, again, as one of the decoys. And she was also, as you may have seen in the last slide, also suspected of murdering the wealthy white slave trader who, we don't know if one of the bodies that was found of the adult male was his body, but yeah, anyway, bodies were found on the property. So Cyrus James stated he had witnessed her take an injured black child outside in her apron, but then didn't return with the child. And she did confess in the jail after being apprehended to nearly 24 murders. And she died actually in the jail cell while awaiting trial in Georgetown, Delaware in 1829. Estimated she was around 60 to 70 years old, but we don't really know, much about how old she was, but around 60, 70 years old. Her body was initially buried in the graveyard of the Georgetown jailhouse, and which also the grounds of the Sussex County Courthouse there in Delaware. And what happened to the rest of the gang? Joseph Johnson received warning of the arrest, that the arrest was imminent of both him and the other gang members, so he and his brother Ebenezer supposedly took a large sum of money with them that they think may have come from that slave trader that was murdered by her, but we don't know. And they skipped town and just went down to, I believe it was Alabama, where they were, they could be safe. And yeah, Patty Cannon's remains, you can see the skulls there in the picture. Her remains, along with 2 others, were exhumed and reburied in Potter's Field near the new jail since the original plot had been developed as a parking lot in the 20th century. And the skull had been separated from the rest of her bones, was put on display in various venues. A courthouse employee actually got the skull and hung it on a nail in his barn. Then he passed it along to a family member who then donated the skull to the Dover Public Library, and apparently for decades the skull was used by the library as part of a Halloween display. And yeah, you can see it in the picture. It was put in storage and then donated eventually to the Smithsonian Institute in 2010 by the library, and it's now on long-term loan. But that is the fate of Patty Cannon, and again, she chose the coward's way out and poisoned herself, but we can estimate she took the lives of roughly 24 people. It's probably even more than that. So these were the sources that I used to just develop this research and to help with the development and curation of the exhibit. And for those who like to, see what sources were used, the work of Milt Diggins, particularly in terms of Thomas McCreary and just unearthing all the facts of Thomas McCreary's actions, was particularly interesting. Milt Diggins was a local, I think, history teacher in Cecil County, and then he just wrote a book about his findings on this person. You can see that I tried to draw from some sources. The writer, different sources. The writer George Alfred Townsend, who many, or those of you who are history buffs may recognize the name. He was a Civil War correspondent, and he was also an author. He wrote, one of his books was The Entailed Hat, or The Times of Patty Cannon, where he actually then did. It has a lot of language in the book that I find that, in our modern, would be considered to be a bit lurid, a bit sensationalistic, and just some things that, given the times, wouldn't be, I don't know, like, it just, but that book was written at the time by George Alfred Townsend about the Cannon Johnson gang, and particularly about the woman Patty Cannon who led the gang, and that's really all I have here.